Objectivity is a hard thing to arrive at, so let's go with subjectivity. And subjectively, Facebook, Dynamite, Uber Bombs, and You has got to be the best title of a talk at this conference. Thank you very much, Lana Brindley.
So this little story starts with the American son of German migrants. His name was Herman Hollerith. He was born in 1860. He got a degree in engineering, and he went off to work in the US Census Bureau in 1879. You will have to forgive me for holding my notes, I can't remember dates. At that time in history, the census was just a head count. They didn't collect any other data. It's just how many people were alive in the country at that time. And that was simply because they didn't have the ability to process that data. As it was, they only ran a census once every 10 years, and it took them several years to process that data. This meant that the big concern of the department at the time was that pretty soon it was going to take them longer than 10 years to process the information. So the next census would be running before they had the previous census completed. Of course, these days, we call that overwhelming technical debt. So young Master Hollerith was a bit of a bright spark. He said, and I quote, "There ought to be a machine for doing the purely mechanical work of tabulating." And he set out to build one. By 1884, he had a prototype, and the US Census Bureau used the machines in the 1890 census. So this is interesting. The data is first encoded on the punch card with the pantograph. Does anyone mind if I use the laser? No? Wonderful. It doesn't go to the recording? No, that's fine. So this is the pantograph down here in the bottom right-hand corner. It's hand-coded, and it's basically just punching holes in the punch card. The operators then load the card into the tabulator, which is this machine up here in the top left. So the card slots into the tabulator, and pins drop down, and where the pins fall through the holes, they go into a little pot of mercury. And the little pot of mercury completes the circuit, and one of the dials that we can see up the top there increments by 1. So each dial on the machine represents one character trait: age, gender, state, that kind of thing. The operator then manually recorded the data, removed the card, and popped it into the sorter drawer. You can only just see it down in the corner of that picture. It's essentially a cabinet with lots of slots in it. Then the human operator resets the tabulator, ready for the next one. And according to the US Census History site, human operators could process 80 cards a minute like this, which I find astounding. So because Hollerith was a bit of a smarty pants, he didn't sell the machines to the government, he leased them. And after a bit, he managed to lease them to all sorts of different departments and organisations all around the world. And that was good, because it kept the money flowing in between the census every 10 years. So to handle this, he created a company which he called, very creatively, the Hollerith Electric Tabulating System. So over the next few years, Hollerith's company found other companies that were making similar kinds of machines. Things like employee punch clocks and weighing systems and interesting things like that. They all merged into a partnership which they called, again, creatively, the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, or CTR. That company then became International Business Machines in 1924. And the companies were finally all merged and became IBM, as we now know it, in 1933. So I actually have a whole other talk on IBM corporate history, which I will not bore you with because it's probably the wrong conference. But the short version is that Thomas J. Watson became IBM chairman in a ridiculously dodgy deal in about 1914 while he was in jail. And remained chairman that is, not remained in jail. He remained chairman until he died in 1956. Because Thomas J. Watson is who he was, or was who he was, He didn't like writing things down. And I mention that because it becomes important later in the story. These are some early IBM machines. They were made by the German IBM subsidiary, which was called Dynamite. Don't worry if you can't read the small writing. I appreciate it's tiny and it's grey. It's actually not all that important. So the German IBM subsidiary is called Dynamite, the Deutsche Hollerith machine company. These machines specifically were the Dynamite Hollerith D11 tabulator, which is the one in the top, and the sorter, which is the one on the left. We've moved on from the wooden cabinet we saw earlier. These were originally used primarily in banks throughout Germany. They were used to process account transactions, calculate compounding interest, that kind of thing. Also, most interesting to the government of the day was that they could cross-reference things like bank account information to census data. I might remind you that we're in Germany in about 1935. You know when you see pictures of people who have been in the concentration camps from World War II, they have a number tattooed on their arm? That number connected the human being to the Hollerith punch card. So here's a fact. In Holland, they had extensive Hollerith machine infrastructure. By the end of the war, 73% of Dutch Jews had been killed. In France, they had a competing technology, which was not compatible. They had very little Hollerith machine infrastructure. What they did have was really disorganized. By the end of the war, 25% of French Jews had been killed. In short, without this technology, the Holocaust would still have happened. It would still have happened, but it would not have been so well organized, would not have been so well executed, would not have been so well planned. Of course, I'm sure you all know about the Nuremberg trials that happened after the war ended. We know about the Nuremberg defense, etc. We remember those Nuremberg trials for the Nazis who got sentenced for war crimes in the main trial. But there were actually 12 more trials. I actually didn't know that, and maybe it was just my education was lacking. There were 13 trials all up between 1946 and 1949, and it covered 177 people. Physicians, judges, military personnel, civil servants, and industrialists. People like this guy, Gustav Krupp. Gustav provided panzer tanks to the Nazis. Interestingly, he was convicted. There's some hilarious confusion between Gustav and his son, which I'll allow you to look up yourself. He was convicted in the end. It didn't actually slow their company down very much. You probably know them as ThyssenKrupp now. They make elevators. Anyway, so you would expect, given that people like Gustav Krupp were up in Nuremberg trials and were found guilty, you would have thought that IBM would have ended up before the Nuremberg trials as well. But the Nuremberg trials were really very unique. They had to be conducted in 4 languages, more or less simultaneously. This had never been done before. Guess who provided the computing power for simultaneous translation? Would anyone like to guess? IBM. Interestingly, and for completely unrelated reasons, I happened to be in Nuremberg a few months ago. I took the opportunity to go to the documentation centre and the Nazi Party rally grounds. It's been a long week. Fascinating tour, took me several hours, quite emotional. Not one mention of IBM. I'd like to have a mental health break now because that was really very heavy. My wonderful room monitor down the front here has some candy. Would anyone like some? I apologise, it doesn't get better. Keep waving, chuck it around. It's genuine Australian candy too, for the record. I brought it all the way here for you. sorry, got a couple more yet. Hopefully what you have picked up so far is that Hollerith was a brilliant young man. He solved a really very difficult problem. It's not his fault that the technology he developed was used by Hitler to murder people. It's also not his fault that not only was no one held responsible for that, but we seem to have collectively forgotten about it. The point I'd like to make here is that throughout history, technology has been used in some really pretty terrible ways. So now I'd like to look at some more historical oh no moments, but I do promise fewer Nazis. You might recognize this guy, Alfred Nobel. He was the guy who invented dynamite. He also owned a large weapons manufacturing plant. Anyway, Alfred's brother died in Caen, in France, and a French newspaper got confused and wrote an obituary for the wrong brother. So they wrote an obituary for Alfred. It was really quite nasty, but I love every minute of it. It was titled, "The Merchant of Death is Dead." And it had this wonderful line in it. Dr. Alfred Nobel became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before. So Alfred read this, had what is technically known as an oh no moment. In the first draft of this talk, it wasn't oh no, I'll mention code of conduct and all that. So he had his oh no moment and completely secretly went on to establish the Nobel Prize with his personal fortune. He wrote it in his will, didn't tell anyone about it, and everyone got a lovely surprise after he died for real. Otto Hahn, who's this guy down in the bottom left, he got the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1944 because he worked out nuclear fission. The prize really should have gone to him with his two co-workers here. This is Lisa Meitner on the left and Fritz Strassmann on the right. Unfortunately, those two had to leave Germany in a bit of a hurry a few years earlier. Sorry, I did promise fewer Nazis. Later on, of course, nuclear fission was the technology that made the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima possible, and the entire world had an oh no moment. And now we have ethics committees in chemistry. Eugenics was the practice of sterilizing portions of the population to stop them breeding. Hitler was obviously a big fan, but I promised fewer Nazis. So let's talk about before World War II, when it was a bit of a big deal in the US. 33 US states had sterilization programs in place against the mentally ill, the disabled people, alcoholics, people living in poverty, and people who were deemed to be promiscuous. Actually seems to largely have ended up being black women, for the record. Some reports say that around 65,000 Americans were legally sterilized during the first half of the 20th century. And of course, that was a bit of an oh no moment for biology. The World Health Organization was created in 1948, after the wars, and it was the first specialized agency of the UN, which I think speaks to how important the UN felt it was. I went through the charter of the WHO to try and find you a nice soundbite to talk about what they actually do. And it's really, really jargony and hard to read, so I decided to summarize it for you. Don't let your government kill you and tell you it's good for your health. Similar vein, some great drug failures like thalidomide have made the idea of having better oversight on medicines seem like a good idea. Thalidomide was sold over the counter from 1957, was recommended to pregnant women for relieving the symptoms of morning sickness. Unfortunately, it also created horrific birth defects. Only 40% of children born with defects survived, and those who did survive were missing limbs. Oh no, right? Court cases were brought against the manufacturer all around the world, including a class action in Australia, which was only settled in 2012. The US Food and Drug Administration was created in 1927, so it predates thalidomide by some way. But the thalidomide cases significantly strengthened the FDA's abilities, and a whole bunch of other laws, including Australia and presumably here in New Zealand as well, were introduced to address drug testing as a result of thalidomide. We didn't let too many bridges collapse before we decided that civil engineering could probably use some regulation. In America, the National Society of Professional Engineers was established in 1932, and they adopted a formal code of ethics in 1964. And it only took one plane flying into a building to establish that maybe we shouldn't let box cutters on planes. Hopefully you see where I'm going here. People very rarely come up with new ideas, new inventions, amazing new discoveries with the intention of killing or hurting people. It's the unintended consequences that cause problems. But it's also those unintended consequences, the oh no moments, that lead to improvements in the way we handle things. We end up with better laws, we end up with better regulations, and our society improves as a result. Ethics committees and government oversight departments and legal rulings don't stop bad things happening. They can help prevent them, and they do give us some kind of recourse when they do. Does anyone need another mental health break? We all good? Cool to carry on? Excellent. Okay. Now, if you read the abstract, you'll know what I'm about to talk about here. I want you to consider these two cases. Volkswagen was caught out having written software code that allowed their cars to cheat emissions tests. Uber also developed software, which was called greyball, which allowed them to cheat law enforcement officials trying to crack down on ride-sharing. The difference between these two cases is that Volkswagen software engineers went to jail, and Uber software engineers didn't. That's because one is a car company, and one is a software company. Startups especially like to use the phrase move fast and break stuff. We know the Facebook line. In IT, we talk about innovation a lot. We think outside the box. I'm sure we've all had that project manager who has encouraged us to challenge paradigms or think different. It's great. It is, it absolutely is. I'm not suggesting we should stop building new things. I'm not suggesting we should stop thinking up interesting ways to solve problems. But what happens when we step back from what we've created and we go, oh no? Really, in my opinion, IT should have had its own no moment when IBM provided the computing power that made the Holocaust possible. But not only did it go unpunished, we've largely forgotten about it over the intervening 80 years. So there's never been a public reckoning. Now, we've looked at some examples of oh no moments that have led to real change. Now I'd like to look at some aspects of IT innovation that have not. I'll start small. The development of the World Wide Web in the 90s was obviously very optimistic, and I am not sure we can blame anyone for failing to see 4chan coming. We can probably blame some of the social media sites for failing to see the dens of iniquity they became, and we can certainly blame most of them for failing to do anything about it. Twitter's response to the incredible amount of white supremacism on their site has been at best ineffective and at worst non-existent. This machine was a medical device used in the 1980s to treat cancer with radiation. It was the third version of this particular device. The previous two devices had hardware interlocks to prevent anything bad happening. So if you moved the machine or did something that could potentially be dangerous, it blew a physical fuse. Human had to go, pull the fuse, put a new one in, go back, start again. This version, though, went completely to software control. It was written entirely in assembly by one guy, it seems, who didn't know what he was doing, and later on couldn't be tracked down. Turned out that the software he wrote had a race condition. When you selected a mode, it took 8 seconds for the machine to move into the right space, physically to move into the right space. If you tried to select anything else during that 8 seconds, the machine would ignore it and not move into the new location. So you would end up with the machine set up for one operation, but the radiation beam set up for another. This literally cooked people. One guy being treated for brain cancer reported a bright light and the sound of frying eggs. He died 3 weeks later. Oh no? They settled out of court. IBM's Watson beat a couple of smart humans on Jeopardy back in 2011. That is Watson the AI program, not Watson the chairman from the Second World War, just to make that clear. We also had Google's machine learning program, AlphaGo. I know it's been brought up in a couple of talks this week already. It managed to beat the Go world champion in 2015. Then, just last year, an AI system that Amazon was using to select resumes turned out to be a little bit sexist, to the complete surprise of none of the women working in IT. From all that, we're now in a place where super convincing deepfake videos are almost commonplace. Last year, BuzzFeed created a deepfake video of President Obama, went a little bit viral, I'm sure most of you saw it. And while deepfake porn has been around for years now, and I do not want to understate the damage that that has done to individuals, I can't help but wonder what happens when deepfake videos of President Trump declaring nuclear war go viral. Some serious danger ahead on that road. I looked into the killer robots thing a few months ago for an unrelated project, because this is how I spend my time. And this is a really tricky one, because the technology being developed for fully automatic weapons system, this is the drones that go in and drop a bomb with no human interaction, right? The technology being developed for that is also used in self-driving cars, aeroplane technology, autopilot, medicine and surgery applications, and even peacekeeping operations. After all, if you can strap a bomb to a drone, you can also strap an aid package. In this case, in South Korea, a university went into partnership with an arms manufacturer, these guys down here, Hanwha, to develop autonomous weapons. Do you know what stopped them? A group of academics from other universities around the world getting together to write an open letter. That open letter was initiated by an Australian academic, and I think the Australians in the audience should probably feel pretty proud of that. And the open letter threatened to boycott the university involved. The South Korean government didn't step in. The UN didn't step in. Without an ethics organisation, what recourse do we have? As it is, we don't actually know that this research has stopped. The Chancellor of the South Korean University wrote a lovely letter saying it had. But the weapons organisation funding it could be quite happily moving along. Who's to say they're not waving large chunks of money at the academics? It's all speculation, of course, but that's really my point. There's no oversight, no regulation, no repercussions, and a hell of a lot of money. Here's one. It was reported in The Economist a few months ago, and it's been picked up a little bit in the mainstream media in the last few months as well. Xinjiang, and I apologise for my Chinese pronunciation, it will be terrible. I try. Xinjiang is a province in northwest China, and it's largely occupied by the Uyghur people. So the Uyghur are the largest Muslim group in China. In Hotan, which is the capital of Xinjiang, there is a police station every 300 metres or so. They look like this. They call them convenience police stations because they have like couches and places to charge your phone and stuff. If you don't think that already sounds like a police state, wait for the next bit. Every citizen has an identity card, and at checkpoints around the province, people will scan your card, they'll take your fingerprint, they'll do an iris scan, take a photograph as well, and then you unlock and hand over all your devices which are put into a cradle with the data downloaded for use later on. That's not just for people they're suspicious of, I might point out. It's for everyone. There are 4 or 5 checkpoints every kilometre. Citizens move through them many times a day. The roads are lined with poles with cameras. The cameras watch pedestrians, but they also perform pattern matching between drivers of cars and the number plates. If you're Uyghur, and you have done even a relatively minor infraction, you get sent to one of hundreds of thousands of, quote, re-education camps, which don't officially exist. No one really knows how many people are locked up. The estimate in the Economist article said 140,000 people in Bhutan alone. The ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, in recent reporting says 2 million. So of course, locking up minority groups for no real reason is not new. But technology is being put to use in this way that has not been happening before. I bet the people who invented facial recognition have had several oh no moments over the past few years. You might also have heard of Palantir. They're the company that use, quote, Minority Report style predictions about crime in an area. You can't find pictures of Palantir, so you have a genuine Minority Report clip here. It was originally developed for the Pentagon to identify terrorists in Iraq. That technology has now been imported to downtown Los Angeles, where it's basically being used, as far as I can tell, to lock up brown people before they commit crimes. So it's not just China. Does anyone need another mental health break? We're good to keep going? Excellent. Give me a minute. I need a mental health break. Okay. So while the increasing mainstream media awareness of personal data and the nefarious uses it can be put to has been really heartening recently, I'm not sure that Cambridge Analytica and Facebook are enough to be considered an oh no moment that we're actually going to change anything. I do think it might be starting. And so now, I bet you're wondering, what does all this have to do with you? I'm so glad you asked. Everyone involved in technology development has a part to play before the product goes to customers. Project and program managers set the scope, define the plan. Software developers write the code. Quality assurance tests software and hardware. Documentation people write the docs. Sales goes out there and sells it. All of us in our day jobs are put in the position of poking and prodding at things we do not fully understand in order to work out how to make it work, how to improve it, and how to discuss it with other people. I say we should expand that thinking just a little bit. How could I use this product to do harm? How could I use it to discover things about people that maybe I shouldn't be discovering? Can I use this social product to stalk my ex? What about someone who said something nasty about me online, or the thermostat in my house that's controlled by an IoT device? Can I use this platform, this API, this plugin, this app, this feature to do something that as a reasonable, moral human being, I don't feel quite comfortable about? It's also important to think about using it in conjunction with other things. Recognizing someone's face is one thing. When you combine that with GPS locations, government databases, purchase history, you have a completely different set of problems. Incidentally, you also have the reason why I don't use supermarket loyalty cards anymore. A point I would also like to make here is that it's not just about ethics. It's not just about individual humans doing the right thing. It's also about legislation and punishments for companies that do the wrong thing. It's about, to coin a term, enforceable accountability. If I can give you one piece of advice, it's to not read your marketing department's hype. Okay, you can read it, but don't believe it. Nuclear fission has saved millions of lives. Through cancer treatment, it's provided light and power to billions, it's made surgery and even our vegetables safer for us through irradiation. That's what the marketing department want you to know. It also made nuclear war a real possible threat, and the marketing department's unlikely to mention it. So, question things, raise bugs, talk about it with your development team and your manager. Until software engineering has a real, honest-to-God, oh no moment, and an ethics board with actual legal teeth is born, you, every single one of you, is at the forefront between technology that hurts and technology that doesn't. Thank you very much.
Big breath, everybody. And questions.
Wonderful talk, Lana, and very insightful. Many of us work with licenses such as the GPL, which has an explicit clause that states that it can be used for any purpose without restriction. What responsibility do we have to consider whether that's something we should continue using and whether it's what the community sees as best?
I mean, I don't have a lot of answers for you, unfortunately, as much as I would like to. Look, I do think it just comes down to your own personal ethics quite a lot of the time. Do you feel like what you're doing is okay? And if it's not, maybe don't do that thing. I agree with you that, yeah, there is some, I realise that I'm following right after Brad as well. Yeah, I do think there is some problematic non-restrictions in there, but I also do think that open is better than not. In the case of the Therac 25 machine, you know, that one guy could never be tracked down. We don't know who he was. He was just some bloke who included a race condition and went off on his way. If it had been open, that would not have happened. We would have found it. So, yeah, unfortunately, like I say, I don't have an answer for you. It comes down to personal ethics.
Do you know of any notable examples of companies or individuals who have set forth kind of ethical guidelines that everyone in their company needs to abide by or consider when developing a feature or enacting some service of some sort?
I do believe that both Facebook and Google, and possibly some others, someone can probably enlighten me there, do have or are working on ethics boards. But like I say, I think this is about enforceable accountability, not just individuals doing the right thing.
Awesome talk. Thank you so much. So I don't know if you have an answer for that because I don't think anyone does. What about the AA bill forcing developers to do unethical, immoral things?
All I can say is I agree with you. There's a whole other talk there. The AA bill came out after I wrote this talk. Yeah, I could talk for hours about that. It's wrong and it's bad and it's going to damage the Australian IT industry. And I feel like there's nothing we can do about it. And I don't know. Governments have a part to play in this. That's all I can say. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Lana. Brilliant talk.
Thank you.
My question's actually a good segue. When you talk about accountability, and we look at our legal system and our governance, our government is actually the one, the Australian government is actually the one that is breaching ethics in a lot of cases. Mm-hmm. What hope do we have when it's actually our government that is breaching a lot of these ethics? You know, when you're combining Centrelink data with tax office data for pejorative purposes, not for protective purposes. what do we as citizens need to do to affect change?
Vote in a better government. I hear New Zealand's good these days.
Though I'd like to just quickly add to that, programming skills are always in demand, and if your boss is telling you to do something that you know is unethical, walk. Somebody else will hire you.
Yep, agreed. I cannot second that enough, absolutely. There's one up in the back.
Next question.
Yep.
I just wanted to say that, and thank you for the talk, that not all military applications are unethical, particularly if they're open source as well. We need a military who are safe in themselves. So if you can provide safer controls for military systems, then it's a good thing to do. But some people are uncomfortable with that, and you've got to follow your own ethics.
And that's what I said on the piece on killer robots. It's exactly what I was trying to get across. That's really tricky, because the same technology that's used for dropping bombs on people is also used for dropping aid packages or helping people out, getting people out of terrible situations. I don't have an answer. I agree that, yes, governments and the military especially do need to have good technology. They do need to have access to this stuff, and they need to be developing that stuff. But we also need to be looking at the larger implications of it. There needs to be an ethical guideline.
I'll say one thing recently, at least in the past year, that Google employees have done is walkouts and so on about, well, sexual harassment, but also, is it Project Dragonfly, where they tried setting up a search engine in China? That got canned, I think.
Well, it's on hiatus, I believe.
Yeah, and they
Depends
also...
who you listen to.
Yeah, and there's also contracting with DARPA about building robots as well that they protested against, and that's something we can do as employees working together.
Absolutely agree. And that comes back to Kathy's point as well. We are bigger than the governments and the employers we have. So if we band together as a group, we can make real change, because that's why democracies are a thing. And it's a good thing, and we should totally do that.
Just wanted to add a quick comment to the having a choice. When we built our company, we specifically put it in a jurisdiction that's favorable. We specifically decided on the features that we can offer without having to include interception gear for government agencies and so on. Made us less profitable, but way happier. So there always is a choice.
Absolutely. I do believe there is always a choice. What I guess I'm advocating here is it's the enforceable accountability thing. Is we actually do need oversight and legislation and those kinds of, and I'm not normally a kind of person who would go around saying we need more laws. But we do in this case. We have laws in all these other fields that govern this stuff and keep us safe, and we do not have laws for software. So absolutely agree with you.
Hi, thank you.
Oh, there you are.
I've noticed that there's a lot more rights being given to customs and police in terms of making people unlock their devices and hand them over. Is there any way you can still be a part of a digital society online and not be subject to that kind of search?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew. As I get older, as I hang around more, as I read more of this truly scary stuff, which, because like I say, I have no life, it's what I do. The more I read, the more I want to throw away my phone. But then I'm like, mobile banking's actually really handy. And so, I mean, I think I put it in the small words so maybe people missed it. But yeah, sometimes it does feel like maybe I should just go away and crawl under a rock and turn off all the internet devices. And yeah, but you know, then I can't feed my child. So that's a problem. Can't do my online banking. You know, I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Thank you for alternating sides. I need the exercise.
Yeah. In the slide where you were talking about when you make something, you look at it and see, could this be put to any bad purpose and things like that. The first thing that kind of came to my mind was, is that actually going to effectively put more bad things out there because everyone's thinking about what bad things they could be doing?
Maybe. I don't know, I guess it depends on whether you believe in the fundamental goodness of people or not.
Yeah.
I like to think I do, but despite all this, I am an optimist. Yeah, I do believe in the fundamental goodness of people, and if we all work together as a collective, like we were talking earlier, then we can affect change, I think, like I said, but I'm an optimist.
Thanks for a wonderful talk, Lana.
You're welcome.
Now, you were saying before about unethical research possibly being hidden. Would it be a good idea to talk about unethical research that's happening, or to silence it so that people don't copycat or whatever?
I'm here at an open source conference. It should always be open as far as I'm concerned. I do believe that there are situations where sometimes it needs to not be open, but I think everything should be open eventually, even if it's not in the first place. So it's a fundamental part of my core beliefs that yes, open is better.
So if you are a person who, say, is an Android developer, and you put code in your app specifically to check if the accelerometers are triggered so nobody can effectively run it in a simulation and test it, that's not open.
It's a lot that's not open about Android development.
You mentioned that the Volkswagen programmers did go to jail, but what was the other example?
The Uber ones didn't.
Yeah, they didn't. Now, is that because of in your mind, is that a difference between the IT industry and the car industry, or is it a difference between European principles and American?
That's a good point. And I mean, it's really hard to pin things down to that one thing. And I'm not a researcher. I haven't gone massively into depth in those two cases, right? From the outside, it certainly does look as though we take car safety and security much, much more seriously than we do IT safety and security, even when that IT is in cars. But I also agree that the European privacy models, GDPR, that kind of thing, do certainly seem to be, shall I say, better than what we use in the rest of the Western world. And I mean, there are certainly cases, and in an early version of this talk I mentioned that as well, that Facebook relocated their headquarters or a lot of their operations to avoid GDPR because it was easier for them to relocate their operations than it was to update their practices in accordance with it. So yeah, there's definitely other considerations there. It's never one thing, is it? I can't see where the microphone is. Oh, hi.
Sorry, it's here. That's I was triggered by part of that statement because it suggested that like the source of the accountability for the Volkswagen tampering was in Europe rather than the U.S. And at least in terms of people going to jail, that might be true. But at least in terms of consequences for the company and customers being made whole, that was not the case. It was the Californian Air Quality Resources Board that discovered the tampering and really researched it. And it was the U.S. federal authorities around that, which really just enforced the Californian standards because that's the weird way that our politics work, that said, so the maximum fine for this is like $40,000 or something per car. So our opening bid is going to be, we have the power to throw like, this many trillions of dollars in fine of you. Let's start negotiating from there. And that's how Volkswagen had to set aside like literal trillions or billions in this case, sorry, getting my orders of magnitude mixed up, of money aside. And like the amount of money they set aside to help to deal with the US exposure that they had was vastly larger than what they had set aside for Europe. And they have a bigger market in Europe, so,
Well, and like I said, those two cases, I really did narrow them down to the very, very simple, and I did that with everything I spoke about, I might add. So yes, there is a lot more nuance that I am able to put into a 40-minute talk. I appreciate that.
One last question, one last hand.
Excellent.
So should we as software developers put more pressure on each other to actually quit when our companies do the wrong thing?
I have to say I've noticed a bit of a theme this week, actually. I am not the only one to have mentioned IBM and the Holocaust this week. I am not the only one to have mentioned the Thrack 25 this week. There's at least one other one that I noticed came up as well, and I do strongly suggest you go and watch all their talks because most of them are way more informed than I am as well. I'm just an angry person, right? But there is a little bit of a theme here, and I think to answer your question, yes, we should all be putting more pressure on everybody and each other.
And one thing that you can do if you're a coder in New Zealand is to join the IT union. Because here, IT workers can join a union, unionize, and get support for delivering their ethics to their employers. If you're in a country without a trade union for IT, you can start one.
There is actually already movements towards a IT workers union in Australia. For the record, feel free to go look that up. And if you're a technical writer, like myself, you do any kind of documentation, you can join the MEAA, the Media Union. I only found that out myself about a year ago. And I've been a tech writer for about 12 years. So if you do documentation, go join the MEAA. Otherwise, get involved in the fledgling efforts for unions for the IT industry in Australia.
Lana, thank you for being persistently awesome.
Thank you.